ever wondered what goes on here at the church throughout the week? Now you know. Hard at work up here at the Brook Church, saving lives, one cake at a time. But, all right, if you have your Bible, find Romans chapter 1. That was incredible. I mean, they're funny during the week when we're making them, but they're so humiliating when I'm watching them with all of you in the background. So we started a series of messages last week called Unbelievable, and it's a series that we're hoping will answer some of the questions and struggles that people have between faith and doubt. And so last week we talked about the resurrection and the unbelievable claim that Jesus rose from the grave. And all of the messages in this series are based on the questions that you have submitted to us, questions that you have wrestled with. And if you have other questions that you would like us to answer, you can see me or submit those as well to the church number. You can actually text the church number those questions. But Luke and I, my oldest son, were driving recently to our house, and across the road on 2920, there's a new building being built. It's a 3-story structure. Some huge windows, are kind of framed out right now, but really it's just all the support systems in there, the plywood and all it's on all the studs. But he asked me, he said, is that going to be a hotel? And when I looked at it, it actually looks like a hotel. The windows are all pretty uniform across. And so when you look at it, you think, yeah, that could possibly be. But the sign in front says it's just a series of shops, of business offices. So we talked a little bit about what it could be. Maybe some medical offices, could be just people needing some office space, whatever it is. But as I was thinking about that later, that building has a certain framework. And that framework determines what you can or cannot do inside of it. For example, if it's built with short ceilings, you're not going to make a gym out of that because the ball would hit the ceiling. You wouldn't be able to play some of the sports that you would want to do. And so the framework kind of determines what the building can be, what it can support, and what it can do. As we continue this series today and next week, what I hope to do is to build a framework. And this framework that I'm going to talk about today and next week will help us as we dig into some of these questions about faith and how we view the world. So today's questions that I want to answer, they were submitted by a few of you, and I think they're profound questions, but they're very challenging to do in a 35-minute message, and so I'm not even going to try. It's just going to be longer than that, okay? That's what we're going to do. But here's the question. One was submitted in this way: is God real? Another person phrased it this way: why do we believe in a supernatural God? And in essence, what the idea was, with all that we know about nature and science, do we really need to believe that there's a God who made it when we have an understanding of all the processes that are in the world today? And one lady actually asked the question, what is the relationship between God and science? And talking specifically as a mom, and we've all faced this, how do I talk to my child who's very knowledgeable, very scientific in their thinking, and they're hearing one thing in school about millions and millions and even billions of years in the universe? How do we reconcile our faith with God? And so I'm going to try my best today to give us a framework for how we're going to answer these questions, but try to attack these specific questions today. Is God real? Obviously, a topic like that is huge. You're not going to walk away from here today with all of the answers, but at least what I hope to give you today is some framework for the rest of the questions that we'll be answering. Now, as we build this out, I want to just share that most of us in this room live in one of two worldviews, and most people in the world live with one of these two worldviews. There is what's called the naturalistic worldview, and there'll be a definition on the screen. Naturalism is the philosophical belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes, and the supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded. In other words, the universe and the natural world is all there is. What you can see, what we can observe, that's all that there is. There is no supernatural force out there. There's no God out there. What we can observe in nature is all there is. Now, atheists typically live in this world. Atheists are those who say that there is no God. And so because there is no God in their mind, the idea is that's based on we have a world that's observable in front of us, and God is not necessary. In fact, there are atheists who have written books about the fact that science has essentially disproved God or made God obsolete, and even have made the claim that God is dead because science is all that there is and nature is all that there is. Many New Age religions Because even though there are many people in our culture who would live with a naturalistic worldview, they do at least acknowledge that there is some kind of spiritual something in us that we can't explain, and we use terms like energy. You know, we're gonna send some good vibes to you. Like, I don't know how you could do that because you're in Arizona. I don't know how I'm gonna get that vibe, but if it's cash, here's my bank account. But other than that, I don't know how you're gonna do that. Send vibes. And so many New Age religions kind of live on this idea that the energy of the universe somehow impacts them. But what you have to see is those who believe in that actually still ascribe to a naturalistic worldview because the energy is a part of the natural universe. Does that make sense? Now, another worldview is what we call theism. Theism is the belief in the existence of a deity. Now, Christians are theists, and all of us in here today pretty much live with one of those two viewpoints or worldviews about the world. There is a God, a theist, or nature is all that there is. If your children are in public schools, your biology teacher is teaching them naturalism. That there is no God, there is nothing that's supernatural or transcendent. The natural world is all that there is, and it can explain every part of our lives. Now, your worldview is like a pair of sunglasses. If I give you a pair of yellow sunglasses with yellow lenses and red ones with red lenses, when you put the yellow ones on, what's it going to do to what you see around you? It's going to shade them toward the color of that lens. You're going to view the world through that lens, and it's going to affect everything that you see. If you take those off and you put the red ones on, then everything's going to have that reddish hint to it, right? Because we see the world through the lens of those glasses, and the lens of those glasses is your worldview. Let me give you an example of this. How many of you have ever been to the Grand Canyon? Just raise your hand. It's an unbelievable experience. The first time you walk up to the edge of that canyon, it inspires awe in you. It's so massive, it's so beautiful, it's so incredible to see. Now, if you're looking through the lens of theism, then what you would say is different than someone who's looking through the lens of naturalism. You look through the lens of naturalism, and what they are, they still have the same awe inside of them, but they're in awe that the universe exists and all these natural processes over millions of years, and ice that came in and broke off rocks, and the river that's flowing through it has carved out this incredibly deep and wide canyon that is just awe-inspiring. They give praise to nature and natural processes. Now, I stand on that edge of that canyon as a theist. I look at it with awe, but I look at it, and certainly as a scientific-minded person, I can appreciate the processes that have been in place to carve out some of that canyon. But I see it as a unique creation of God, and I give God the praise for being the one that put all of those processes in place. I praise the creative mind of God that can make something that when you stand on the edge of it is so overwhelming to you that it inspires awe. You see, your worldview affects how you see it. When an atheist holds a newborn baby for the first time, there is a sense of awe that they feel. But their awe and the lens that they see that through is different than when I held my child as a theist. The naturalist would say, wow, it's amazing that a baby has come into the world and there are processes in place that make this happen. And so they see it and have the same sense of awe, but they see it through a different lens. As a theist, I see it and say, man, God has given me a beautiful child, made in his image, uniquely created in the image of God, and on and on. You see, your worldview affects the way that you view the world around you. Now, today, I want us to look in the Bible, and I want to just give this caveat here to this whole discussion. When I talk about the framework, you've got to come back next week. Because next week I'm going to talk about why I believe we can seek the Bible for the answers to the questions that we have. But I won't answer that really till next week. But I want us to look today in Romans chapter 1 and just do a study here of what Paul says in this book, beginning in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. He writes, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." The gospel is the good news that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again for sins. He said, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for that gospel is the power of God into salvation for everyone, to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous or the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Now, I just want to pick apart these verses very quickly. In verse 16, I want us to begin with the gospel, because Paul, in verse 16 and 17, essentially lays out what the entire book of Romans is about. And we find in verse 16 the gospel. And the gospel is the power of God to salvation. And it's the power of God to save everyone. I want you to know, regardless of whether you're a naturalist or you're a theist, it doesn't change the truth of God in this way, that God desires for you to know and encounter the gospel, because that gospel is the power of God to save you. Now, you could say there is no God and not believe that. It doesn't change that that is what God has revealed to us in His Word, and we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail next week. But I want to just make this point here about the Bible. The Bible never argues for the existence of God. The Bible assumes the existence of God. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. There's no argument there for God's existence. It's simply a statement of fact that here's the historical record. God created it all. So if you're trying to use the Bible as like a logic textbook to try to prove to people that God exists, the Bible doesn't argue for God's existence. The Bible assumes God's existence. And in verse 16, I want you to know that the heart of God is revealed for you. The heart of God is to rescue mankind. His plan is redemption. His plan is to bring salvation. Now in verse 17, we find an important truth, and that is that God's plan for declaring us righteous is faith in that gospel. The righteous shall live by faith. And that means that the means by which one is made right with God is faith. I want you to know this about man-made religions. There are a lot of philosophies about God who claim to know the way to God. And all man-made religions have a basic premise. There is a God, and you're not it. And in order to be right with God, you got to jump through all the religious hoops to get to God. But that is not biblical Christianity. That is not a biblical worldview. What the Bible teaches is that there is a God, and that God is pursuing you even though you were a sinner. And God made a way for you to be right with Him, but it's not through religious activities. It's God rescuing you and you placing your faith in what Christ has done for you on the cross, the gospel of Jesus. So God is pursuing us. Now I want to say this, there's a ton of evidence for the existence of God, but in the end, we must take God by faith. Now, people on the internet and the modern atheist would say that your faith is blind and your faith is stepping out into nothingness. And we use phrases like, you have to have a leap of faith. But I will tell you that my faith in God is not a leap of faith, it's a small step of faith. Let me give you an analogy. If you imagine that there's a canyon and we're on one side of it and God is on the other side of that canyon, and our desire is to be right with God, and in between us are the steps that it would take for us to get to God. And what moves the side of the canyon is the evidence for God. I've shared this before. When I went to college at HBU, I made the basketball team, and I had a teammate who was an atheist. And he began to ask me very difficult, challenging questions about my belief in God. He was a naturalist. He believed that there was no God. And he began to ask the questions that I simply didn't have the answers to. And here's what I felt like. God is on the other side of that canyon, and with everything I couldn't answer, I felt like that canyon was getting farther and farther and farther away. But then as I began to study world religions, I began to study philosophy, I began to study the Word of God and picked it up and read it from cover to cover for the first time in my life, I began to see that the evidence for God is overwhelming. And that canyon began to come closer and closer and closer and closer. And what I tell people all the time is that my faith in God is a reasonable faith. It's a rational faith because it is a faith that is based upon the evidence, but it is faith. There is a step of faith that we have to take. And Paul says in verse 17, the just, the righteous shall live by faith. And so there is a step that we must take in our belief in God. But I do believe that it takes less faith to believe in God than it does to believe that your life is the result of random natural processes. Ultimately meaningless. Verse 18 is an intriguing verse. In verse 18, Paul writes this, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against, underline this word, all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Now, Paul says that the wrath of God, and I want to just play this out for a moment, God by definition would be the greatest of all possible beings. One of the things that you do when you see arguments or debates between atheists and theists or naturalists and theists is they always ask the question, well, who made God? And the answer is no one made God. Because if someone made God, then that someone would himself be God. Because he would be even transcendent or more powerful than God, and he would be before God. So we do not believe in a God who was made. We believe in a God who made the world, and that there's a very distinct difference there. But Paul says in verse 18 that this holy, righteous, unmatched God, his wrath is revealed. And all of the qualities of this God are infinite because he's an infinite, matchless God. But I want you to see what the wrath of God is revealed against in that verse. This is really, I found this study to be quite fascinating. He says, first of all, his wrath is against ungodliness. The Greek word there means impiety. And what it means is to neglect to worship or to honor God. So the wrath of God from heaven is revealed to men against the lack of worship of God. And then he says his wrath is revealed against the unrighteousness of men. And that literally means sins toward people. One of the questions that people ask about faith is if there is a God, what about all the injustices? Why do some children have cancer and other children don't have cancer? Why do some people suffer and other people seem to have it easy? And so we reconcile these questions, and then we say in the end, and people struggle because they say God in the end is not going to make up for the injustices. But verse 18 says to us that the wrath of God is revealed against those who don't worship God and then those who sin against their fellow man. Listen, if there is a God, all the injustices are going to be wiped out by God. All of the books are going to be reconciled by the wrath of God. And the use of these two phrases tells us why all of us in this room today are condemned before God and deserving of God's wrath. And it's very simply this: we have all failed to worship God as we should, and we have all hurt our fellow man. We've all sinned. And that's true. You don't have to convince me I'm a sinner. I know that I am. And I know there have been times in my life where I sat on the throne of my life and did not worship God as God. And God would have been just to give me his wrath. One of the questions people wrestle with is, how can a loving God send people to eternity for hell for their sin? And that's the wrong question. The right question is, how could God let anyone into heaven? That's the question. Because all of us are deserving of the wrath of God because we do not honor and worship God all the time with our lives, and we have sinned against our fellow man. All the injustices that we see in our culture that make us crazy and infuriate us, the wrath of God is revealed against those, and we all deserve the wrath of God. But notice the last phrase of verse 18. Who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. That tells us something about mankind. Whether you're a naturalist or you're a theist, you know the truth. But the problem is, naturalists suppress the truth. Those who say there is no God do not accept the truth for what it is. And what's the truth in that verse? Well, it's the truth that God exists and the truth of our sin, that the wrath of God is revealed against our sin, and they suppress it. Why? Verse 18 tells us, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. One of my hobbies is to watch online debates. It's weird, between theists and naturalists. I love it. There are some brilliant people on both sides of it, and I feel like it's so enriching to hear all the evidence that's positioned for belief in God and even those who do not believe in God. But there's something that happens when you especially look at the atheistic people that argue that side. In the end, the heart behind their atheism is not that there is no evidence, it's that they refuse to believe the evidence, and the heart behind it is they don't want to be told by God what to do. That's the core of that issue. It's not that there is no evidence for God, it's that I'm not going to acknowledge that as evidence for God because I want to be the God of my own life. And you see it come out in some of the things that are said, even the things that are written. Listen, if you don't believe there's a God and you're an atheist and you're a naturalist, why are you writing books trying to prove that something that doesn't exist doesn't exist? Why are you writing those books? Leave it alone if it doesn't exist. Do you see any books on the stands trying to prove to people that unicorns don't exist? There are no books about that because there's no evidence for unicorns. But there are mounds of books trying to disprove the existence of God because the evidence is overwhelming. The cliff of evidence keeps coming closer and closer. And when you see the evidence for the existence of God, I'm going to step over there. It's a step of faith and I believe it, but it's a faith that's based upon surety and evidence. Now look at verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. A few things in that verse. God can be known. It's obvious. And I want you to hear this. God is not hiding from you. It's plain. He's there. And verse 19 says that God has shown it to them. So they have seen the evidence for God. But in verse 20, listen to this. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. I love verse 20 because all the young people in the room, I want you to hear this. All the kids in high school and the young people in college, I want you to hear this. You are going to encounter professors and teachers who are going to tell you that if you believe in God, you cannot believe in science. It's a lie. What you find in verse 20 is God, who is invisible, that none of us have seen with our eyes, is real. And we know that he's real by looking at the natural world. That's what God says. You want to know if I'm real? Study science. Study the world. Stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon. Explore. Ask the questions. And if you will look at those things, verse 20 says, the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen. How? In the things that are made. Look at it and you will see clearly that it's God. Leslie and I had to go visit the eye doctor because she's getting older, and I wanted to support her. No, babe, just kidding, babe. You're beautiful. If those that saw my picture I posted this week, like, hey, did you marry your daughter? I mean, I look like a pawpaw, and she stays young. It's unbelievable. So if you ever go to the eye doctor, they bring that machine to your eyes, and they ask that question, like, which one's better, number 1 or number 2? And you look at that, well, I think it's number 1, but it's still blurry. Well, what's that letter? That's an F. Which one's clear, number 1 or number 2? I think it's number 1 this time. Well, what's that letter? I think that's a G. Okay, which one's better, number 1 or number 2? And then they finally get that right lens, and you see it was an A. You know what I'm saying? And you're like, I really do know the alphabet. Those were not guesses. It was like my SAT test, right? I really did know those. But you can clearly see it when you get it right. But I want you to see in verse 20 that God says to us, Paul says that the invisible attributes of God can be seen. You can see these attributes, and there's 2 of them. His eternal power, which means his omnipotence, his matchless eternal power, and his divine nature, his deity. And how do we know those 2 things? By the world that we see around us, standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, holding the newborn baby for the first time, looking at a field of bluebonnets and looking at how beautiful those flowers are. Look at nature, and you will see that there is a divine God who made it. Ever since the creation of the world, he says, we see God. So when we see creation, it tells us there's a creator. When we're in awe of the beauty of a field of bluebonnets, we're in awe of the creative mind of God. When we see our newborn baby for the first time, we see the obvious fingerprint of the giver of life. And we can see God clearly, even though he is invisible by the things that are made. Now pause there for a second, and do not put standards upon God that you're not willing to put on anyone else, because everyone in this room believes in the law of gravity, but not one person in this room has ever seen it. What does gravity look like? You've never seen it, but what you see is the evidence of gravity. You're not floating out of your chair. So you believe in something that you have never seen, and the reason you believe it is because you see the evidence that that's in place. Now think about this for just a moment. I love 2020. Although everybody's murdering everybody out there, and it's always husband and wives, and it's a little disturbing, honestly. And it always begins the same way, right? I've talked about this before. They were a loving family, and then it's like, well, one of these is gone. You better watch your back. Then they get the detective in there. The person's missing. They find out they're dead. And then they bring the detectives in. And they look for the blood stains, right? They look for the hair follicles. They find an item found in a trunk. They will find an item that was used in the killing, and they will go around to every Walmart that sold that knife and find it. It's incredible. And then they indict somebody and they convict them based on a receipt. You bought that knife at Walmart, and that's the knife that was used there, and we know it had your fingerprints on it, and all of a sudden it's like, dude, you're guilty, man. It's unbelievable. It's incredible. But what they do in that show, they use this phrase all the time, the trail of evidence. The detectives followed the trail of evidence. Creation is the trail of evidence that God left to reveal himself to us. Kids, science and nature is what God has given you to reveal himself to you. So when you're watching that teacher in your science class put those chemicals together and it looks like toothpaste coming out of that, there's a creative God that put all the world and the processes and all those elements on the periodic table, and he put them together in perfect unity and harmony to show you, hey, I'm here. Psalm 19 and verse 1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. My son Luke is an incredibly talented artist. He loves to draw cartoons. He's done that since he was a kid. He's written comic books. He's written novels. It's incredible. He's very creative, but he has a very distinct style, and he talks to us a lot about he's kind of, put his style together, and we've seen so many of his drawings that if you were to take comic books out here today and there were 300 of them just spread out, I could instantly know which one is his because I've seen his artwork. And it's the way it is with God. When we look at the heavens, when we look at the stars, they tell us there's only one person that made it, and it's God. And it's not random chance. It's not just natural processes. There's a God who transcends nature, and the heavens declare this is his artwork for us. Now, when I was in college, my professor told me there are ways that God reveals himself to us, and so I want to define revelation for a moment. Revelation is the free act of God by which he graciously condescends or comes down to display and reveal his character, nature, and will to mankind. And in college, I learned that God gives us two basic forms of revelation, what's called general revelation, which is available to everyone, and special revelation, which is what I'm going to talk about next week. So you got to come back for that. General revelation is nature, creation, but it's also moral conscience, which we'll get into that in just a moment. And special revelation is the special revelation of God in both the person and the work of Jesus and his Bible, his word that we have in our laps or on our phone today. I'll talk about that all next week. I want you to know this about science. Science and nature are not in conflict with faith in God. In fact, science and nature are proofs of God's existence. You don't have to crucify reason and exploration and rationality and curiosity or a love for science in order to believe in God. You can stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and be in awe of the beautiful world around you and all the science and all the processes, but not give glory to the creation. You give glory to the one who set it all in motion, the one who made it. Let me share with you from some proofs for the existence of God. I'm going to go through these very quickly, but you can look these up. You can Google them. That's a search engine on the internet, by the way. You can Google these things and look them up. They're fantastic arguments, but there are a lot of good reasons to believe in the existence of God. One of them is called the cosmological argument. There are two premises and then a conclusion. I want you to see these. First of all, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now think about that. Is that true? If something begins to exist, there's something that caused it to begin. That iPhone that you're holding, there wasn't a scrapyard that burped one day and that iPhone popped out. Right? That thing was created by someone or something. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. Now philosophically and scientific data proves that premise is true. Even most naturalists and secular atheists would agree that the universe is not infinite. The universe did not exist in eternity past. They look back because then you'd have infinite regressions. They know that the universe began at some point. They theorized something like a Big Bang, that it all began, and then there was this explosion and the universe is expanding. You've heard those things in your science class, but scientists would agree that the universe began to exist. Well, if everything that begins to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist, what's the conclusion? Then the universe has a cause. And that cause is not a part of the universe. The cause has to transcend nature. If that's true, then the cause of the universe is a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful creator. And I call him God. Now, the second proof is what's called the teleological argument. And that is an argument from the design of the universe. The design of the universe demands a designer. Think about that for just a moment. The water cycle, you learned about that in school, right? Water's on the ground, the sun heats it up, it evaporates, goes up in the clouds, they get heavy, and then it rains. And that rain replenishes the earth, makes the plants grow. And then within the plants and humans, there's this beautiful connection called photosynthesis, where plants emit a gas that is helpful for us. And when we breathe it in and breathe out, we breathe out a gas that is helpful for plants. And do you know what? That all happened by accident. That's insulting to you, isn't it? For me to say that to you. And yet your science textbook is going to try to convince you that all came about by random natural processes. It's garbage. And it's not backed up by the evidence in science. The fossil record doesn't back up many of the claims that are made about science. You're telling me that all happened and we have to be the perfect distance from the sun, not one small move toward the sun, we'd burn up, not one small move away from the sun, or we'd freeze to death and it couldn't support life. Just perfect atmospheric conditions for the world to be supported. There's enough water, there's enough here for us to live, and you're telling me it's all just this cosmic accident. Just one little speck of dirt in the expanse of the universe that ultimately means nothing. Does that seem plausible to you? What seems plausible to me is that there is a God who caused it all to come into existence. And he wants a relationship with those he created. He loved you. And he created a world for you to enjoy. That's what happened when God created Adam and Eve, right? Enjoy the earth. Subdue it. Be fruitful. Multiply. Replenish the earth. God designed you to live. But yet we see in the world around us all this incredible design, and people say, nah, natural processes. NASA is trying to get to the moon so that we can ultimately get to Mars. Now let's imagine this. We put a rocket on Mars, we put people there, and they get on that planet and they find a beautiful biosphere there. That just beautiful dome, has all the elements inside that you would need to support life. You think one NASA person would say to you, that all happened by natural processes on Mars. Isn't that amazing? The first headline would be, intelligent life found on Mars. And if they sent that rocket ship from another planet to the earth and they find this incredible biosphere with all these natural processes in place and this beautiful planet that's supporting life, and they say it all happened by accident, they refuse to admit that there's an intelligent God who designed it with such beautiful detail. But just because they deny it doesn't mean it's not true. The third argument is what's called the moral argument. The moral argument goes like this: if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. What that means is simply this: if there is no God and you're just an animal, you can do whatever you want. Okay? Number two, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. I'm not going to read it for sake of time. And when I went to the eye doctor, that's part of the problem why I can't see that clock on the back wall. I just have real bad vision, so I don't want to correct it. It just looks like a blur of white numbers moving, but I don't know what it is. If you read in Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 16, here's what Paul says. When people who are not a part of the law, when unbelievers by their very nature do the things that are in the law, it shows that a consciousness of God, a moral law, is written on their hearts. Because we know right and wrong, do you know what that tells us? There's a moral lawgiver who gave us what is right and wrong. Does anybody in this room today think that it's against moral nature for a lion to kill another lion to establish dominance and a pride? Of course not. That's what animals do. But if every person in this room would think it's wrong for one husband to kill another husband to get his wife, everybody in here thinks that's morally wrong. Do you know why? Because you're not an animal. You're made in the image of God, and God is the moral life giver. And he created you with a knowledge of what is right and wrong. Don't let any professor tell you that you're an advanced primate who somehow decided to lose your tail. Wouldn't you have loved to have a tail? Why did we lose that? You know what I'm saying? I'd love to have a tail swing around on a tree. You know, I mean, like... that is so dumb, you know? Don't ever let them tell you dumb stuff like that. You are not an advanced primate. You are made in God's image. And he made you with a knowledge of what is good and what is wrong. The fourth evidence is probably the most compelling for me, is life itself. Science cannot explain why life began to exist. Let's give the Big Bang to him. In the beginning, there was nothing, and nothing created something. If that's not insulting to your intelligence enough, let's go to the next step. That in that nothingness, something came, and those somethings were all these different kind of molecules, carbon, oxygen, these things. And they cataclysmic event, the universe began to expand, all these different planets and solar system. I mean, it's incredible that all happened just by random nothingness, but it did. But what they cannot explain to you is how those molecules who were not living spontaneously generated. There's not one test that's ever been done that shows that non-living things come to life. This music stand will never become a living music stand because of the laws of nature. And yet, all the scientific hypotheses you read in your textbooks are built on that idea that life began from non-living things. And it's not possible scientifically. Life itself is proof of the existence of God. If there is no God, then death should be inevitable and we should be fine with it. And when we go to a funeral, we shouldn't cry because that's just the way that it is. But it feels different when you're sitting in a funeral service than it does when you're sitting in a hospital room holding your baby for the first time. You know why that feels different? Because we're born and we're made to live, not born to die. But if there is no God and it's just natural processes, that's what happens. It goes from order to disorder and decays, and death is the end. But because there's within us a desire to live, that's a fingerprint of God in your life. It's a trail of evidence that God placed in you, that you were created in his image and created to live. And the end of verse 20 says that because God has made all of this so clear in what's been made, he says at the end of verse 20, they are without excuse. There is a God, and we will stand before him one day. And we'll be without excuse in that day. We will not be able to say to God, there was no evidence for your existence. God will say, the evidence was ample. You suppressed the truth because of your sin and unrighteousness. Now, if you look at verse 21, I'll kind of bring this to a close. Verse 21, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. That sounds a lot like us today, doesn't it? And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. This is what happens. God is real. He makes himself known, but they did not worship him. They refused him. They continued to fall into sin, and we see it happening in our culture, and we worship man rather than worship the God who made us. But I want to remind you what I said at the very beginning of this message in verse 16. God is not trying to prove himself to you. God is pursuing you. He made you, and he loves you even though you rebelled against him. And he made a way for you to be right with him. And that way was not through religion. It was through a relationship with the all-powerful creator of the universe. And he revealed himself to the world in his creation. And the heavens declare the glory of God. And next week we're going to talk about the revelation of God through Jesus and his word. But the existence of nature, its processes and laws, does not disprove the creator. It points to the creator. It tells us that there is a creator who loves us and is pursuing us. Is God real? Yes. And why do we believe in a supernatural God? Because the universe exists. And the universe began to exist, and it has a cause, and that cause is God. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. There's time, space, and matter right there in the first verse of your Bible, that God created everything that was necessary for this universe to exist. I'll close by sharing a story from a few years ago in 2012. My family and I had the opportunity to host some young people from China for a program where students were to come to the United States and experience what life was like in America. My family took in two young boys, Lebo and Ray, and it was an interesting dynamic. They were with us for a few weeks, and they just lived with our family. Wherever we went, they went. And they knew English, and so we would communicate. It was a beautiful relationship. During their time here, they called us mom and dad, and when we've connected with them afterward, they still call us mom and dad, and so it's really kind of a beautiful thing. But they're just supposed to live with your family and do what you do. And so on Sundays, we went to church, and I was pastoring at Berean Baptist Church at the time, and we brought them with us, and there were 19 students in the total program, and I think 14 or 15 of those were were living with other families within our church during that time. So about 14 or 15 of them were with us on that first day. Of the 19, all 19 of them checked the box that they were atheists, and that was their religious affiliation. So they came with us to church that day. It was interesting. Our worship pastor was out, so I had to lead worship with my guitar. I led worship and preached that day, and so we did congregational greeting, kind of like we do here. We shake hands in fellowship. And while that was happening, I'm standing up playing with the worship team, and Ray and Lebo and the other Chinese students came up and took selfies with me on the ground. They thought I was like a Jesus rock star. It was awesome, dude. They had never been to church in all their lives, and they're at the front of the stage like, hey, it was awesome. It's like, hey, it's awkward but different, but okay. So went to church, preached the word, and they went to youth group that night. And then Chinese culture at that time, the laws have now been changed, but at that time each family could only have one kid because they were trying to control population there. And so all the kids who came were the only child of their family. So at that time, Adam was about a year, and they loved Adam. I mean, they loved him because he was a baby. And so we took them, one of the Texas experiences we took them to was the Hempstead Watermelon Festival. And I mean, just let that sit on you for a second. A Chinese student we get out of the car, and there's a barbecue pit in the shape of a pistol. I'm like, you got any questions? Get back in the car. You know, like, welcome to America, welcome to Texas. And I remember that day was really hot. We got back in the car, and Adam was just tired, and he was melting down, just screaming. We put him in the car seat. We get in the car, we get all the kids in. We're trying to get out of there, and I told one of the boys, Ray, I said, Ray, I'm so sorry, because Adam was sitting right next to him, and it was so loud. And I said, I'm so sorry that he's screaming. He's just really tired. And Ray said, oh, it's beautiful. I don't hear sounds like that in my family. They loved Adam. So they went to church with us that day, and on the way home that night, I asked them, I said, what did you think about church? Now, both these boys are atheists. They're both naturalists. There is no God. And they said it was very meaningful to us. I said, okay. And I said, well, let me ask you this. How do you believe that life begins? And they quoted just out of every science textbook that I ever read. There was a big bang, natural processes, life came through primordial soup, single-celled organisms got together and became more complex, and then we had fish, and we had amphibians, and reptiles, and birds, and mammals, and primates, and on down, and then that's how we came into existence as humans. And so I asked them the question I asked earlier, and I said, listen, if a lion kills another lion to establish dominance in the pride, is that morally wrong for that lion to do that? And they said, no, it's just nature. It's natural selection, right? It's survival of the fittest. And they got old, and that one established dominance, and it's okay. And I said, and they were here right after that shooting had happened in that movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, where the gentleman went in the man went in the theater and shot those people and killed them. And I said, let me ask you this. He went in that theater and shot all those people. Was that morally wrong for him to do it? And they said, yeah, he shouldn't have done that. And then I asked the question, if we're just advanced mammals, why is that wrong? And they just sat there like they had never been asked that question before. I said, some animals, they actually kill their young. That's not uncommon in the natural world. I said, you think it'd be okay for me if I didn't like the way that Adam was living, or I felt like there was something wrong, there was a defect in Adam, you think it'd be okay for me to kill my kid? He said, no. I said, but you don't think it's wrong for a bear to do that? And they do it. Why is that? And they had no explanation. Do you know why? Naturalism can't explain the very basic questions of life. And I told him, can I share with you what I believe? And that is this, that there's a God who transcends space, time, and matter and nature, and by the power of his word spoke this universe into existence. And he formed this world at the perfect distance from the sun to support and sustain life. And he took the dirt of that earth, and he formed it into a man and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul, made in the image of God. You see, Ray, when I'm holding Adam, he's not a pet. He's not an animal. He's a unique creation of God. He's different. None of those boys made a profession of faith that week. But what I wanted them to see was that there's a more plausible explanation for what we feel and what we see in the world than random chance. And that explanation is there's a God who made us and made this world. And I want every person in this room today, regardless of what end of that spectrum you live in, whatever world you have, that God is pursuing you. And he pursues you all the way to the cross. So today, I just want you to open your heart to him if you never have before. And in opening your heart to him, you'll find purpose and meaning for your life that you never knew existed before. He's real, and he's plainly seen if you will just open your heart to see him. Will you stand with me today with your heads bowed and your eyes closed? We're going to worship him. And I just want to pray over us. God, thank you for your goodness and your kindness to us. Thank you for giving us the trail of evidence for your existence, proving that you are who you said you are. Thank you for the beauty of your creation that declares your glory. And we join in with the chorus of creation today and cry out to you in worship for all that you've done. And I pray, Lord, that if there's someone that's struggling with their faith and struggling with answering the question of whether you're real or not, that today this message would at least cause them to pursue and to ask the questions and to begin to turn and reorient their hearts towards you and open their hearts to you and your existence. And when they do, Lord, I pray that you'll make known to them the glorious gospel, that you want a relationship with them. But that relationship is broken by sin. And yet you in your gracious love toward us made a way for us to be right with you. And Jesus came and he paid the price for our sins so that we can have that relationship with you. So I pray that even today hearts would be drawn to you. We thank you so much for all that we have in Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen.